All right. Well, welcome everybody, whoever may be watching, and Bree and Jeannine to. So maybe this is like the first legitimate podcast episode for those that might have seen this as the Finding Good podcast. And we're getting it a little more focused. Before we had the broader conversations, and now we're going to have conversations about connection from people from all different walks. Like, what does that word connection mean? Like, everybody knows what connection feels like, and we also know what disconnection feels like. But like, it's sort of like ephemeral. Like it's this thing we can't really put our finger on. So we thought it would be entertaining, informative, and helpful to get different perspectives on what connection looks and feels like in different industries, from different people. And so we're going to do our first episode today with somebody that volunteered, who didn't know they were volunteering until you got a random email last week that said, look, we're going to change the whole thing. What do you think? And so we're going to try the Bree, go ahead and introduce Jeannine for us.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce Jeannine Pohl. She owns Black Portrait Studios in St. Paul, Minnesota. She's a photographer with 18 years in the wedding industry, and recently she shifted to photographing business headshots and family portraits in her St. Paul studio. So tons of connection and great things to talk about here. Thank you so much, Jeannine, for joining us today.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun working with you in the previous format, and I look forward to listening to stories for the upcoming little bit more deeper conversations one-on-one with people.
Yeah, no, me too. And I was sort of thinking about this like format before. I thought it actually would be really cool to start off with like just this broad question of like, when you hear that word connection, like, what does it mean? Like, so to a degree, like, what is your, like, do you have a definition of connection? Yeah.
I do. And connection has always been a part of my brand in what the values in my business are. And obviously an easy one for weddings is connection, and building that authentic portrait of my wedding couples through connection and posing, and also how I can impact my clients' connection by prompts that I have them do, by asking questions within their family members of what their connections are, building really genuine and true to that couple, what those relationships look like. And in a wedding day where it can be a lot of chaos, to pause and create genuine portraits of connection in there, and not just leaving it to the whim of whatever's happening is happening, but knowing intimately who those people are and presenting opportunities to build portraits around that. So when I was building out my studio for families and for high school seniors, and understanding what that means for building connection for not just me to the client, but truly what I can do in a photograph to display who they are in the eyes of other people who know that person. So in a family, I'll build out like questions around like relationships with mom and son or daughter, and then I'll ask, as a spectator of your partner with your kids, what does that look like to you? So finding connections from my clients and how I can incorporate that into the portrait. So when I build that portrait for them and we look at that portrait after the session, I can say, hey, when you told me that thing that you said with this person, I see that in this photo. So it's not just a portrait of a family at that point. It's not just a portrait of a person, but it really brings like their true connection of who that person is and who they are to them.
Yeah. So in that, like, the connection there is like a deeper understanding then, or is it like the relationship of one to the other? I'm curious, like, yeah, like dive in, like, because you said a couple of times, like, I'll interview this, like find out about them and find out about this one. But what is it that makes the connection? Is it the acknowledging the relationship in there, or is there something else that tells you like, oh, we create a connection here?
So both. So obviously the connection between my client and me, I want to be there, but I think I serve that by serving my clients best in getting true connections of the people that they love the most, and that like they're coming to me to photograph. If I can really display and interpret their connections, how they have communicated to me, then I can serve them best in our connection by doing that. Does that make sense? Is that even the question that you asked me?
Yeah, it's interesting how easily like that word can like kind of like branch. Like you talked about the connection between them and then also with you, and that's like there's this almost like dance going on that I kind of see in there.
There's also a third one of then who's ever looking at that picture. Like the connection between the people that are in the pictures, that dynamic between you and them, and then also anyone who's looking at that picture, seeing, connecting with them as well and seeing that person that they know. I think there's 3 layers of connection there.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the value that it is of not just the transaction of a portrait, and maybe like the arguments to what to wear for that portrait, or like the haircuts that are in that portrait, but the actual deeper like reason that you're doing the portraits in general, like going back to that part of like those meaningful relationships, and not the surface, like this is family of perfection type of thing, which I think is kind of superficial. And what I don't want to do for families, I want to bring that meaning to the actual connection within that family.
So in that, I'm curious, when did you like discover that you wanted to do that in that way, right? Like that photography was going to be about connection and not that other thing that you had talked about. I don't know if that was like while you were a photographer before, but like tell me about like when, if you could think about it, like when you decided like connection was going to be that much a part of what it is you do.
Working with couples in their engagement portraits, I found that it was kind of something that was resistant for a lot of guys that would come into portraits of being like, oh, I'm dragging along to do this. Like it didn't have to be that way necessarily if I prompted them for things that they really became connected with their partner through that experience. So to make it a truly an experience in the questions that I ask of each other, and allowing that partner to answer them and be vulnerable by answering my question, but talking about the other person, you could see that other person light up. So if you ask somebody like, when did you know that this was a person that you were going to marry? And then sometimes that other person didn't know that. So the stories that come of it and the impact that you have by them sharing that just builds a deeper connection between the two of them. So that's really launched that.
And do you remember like the first time you tried that?
Do I remember?
So like the first time you tried that with the dude that was being drug in, like was there like a first moment that you're like, because I imagine you had to learned it somewhere, but also like had to try it on first.
I think it was a little bit of like how the experience, because there's so many questions that you can ask when you're working with a client, and it can be kind of surface, like you can focus all on the wedding. And I think I did that for a really long time, like just talk about the wedding the whole time that we're in the portrait session. But I think the more genuine portraits started to come from asking a little bit deeper questions with people in between posing and prompting and stuff like that. So I don't remember a specific time that was it. I can tell you for weddings, that is, with working with engaged couples, but I can tell you when I knew I wanted to focus more on portraits in the studio, that transition from having a really specific reason couples were in front of my camera was on a a wedding, and that was something we could talk about. Moving that into the studio was a lot harder, and it did not seem natural to talk about those things. Like when I would have somebody that wanted to come in to have their family photographed, of how to get that deeper layer.
What was it about it that didn't feel like using your, like, tell me about that, but and that part of like, why did that feel so different in that space? Yeah.
Well, I wasn't personally being fulfilled by creating family portraits, because I can have anybody walk in the door and come in front of my camera, and I know how to pose you, and I know how to light and the backgrounds. Like I know all the technical things, but it was not creatively fulfilling to me because it's so surface. So being able to have that next layer into the portraits and to create an actual connection between people and understand them, it almost made working with clients and creating and storyboarding way more of a creative process.
And I know, Bree, you had questions on
Well, first I would love to just dig into like when you were initially like, oh, this is not my jam. What was it that helped you feel that? Or, you know, was it feedback that you were getting through folks? Was it just like you mentioned the word superficial a couple of times. I'm curious, like, what were the feelings and the reactions that you were getting in that when you first started transitioning to portrait?
It's really like one-off answers from clients that I was getting. It was me not asking and layering questions and allowing people to think a little bit deeper about things. And if I wasn't getting answers, I would just kind of like default to like, okay, well, we don't have to go down this route. Like just because the silence, the pause, like all those things that cause us to kind of like, resistance behind it. So reframing some questions to be like, I know this is a weird question. And that allows people to be ready for the weird question like that, or and also questions to be like the response of what was that tool of, you might not know, but if you did know, what would it be? Like that one is also a tool that I found to get a better answer back for people when I'm asking questions.
Is that like, just what do you think creates that? Like, because I know a lot of people in coaching, they use that all the time. If you did know what it would be, what would it be? Like, what makes that so useful, do you think?
You can't be wrong. Right?
Like, so like, is that like just giving them permission to sort of say whatever it is?
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just pick up on that because it's like, Bree's probably at the same time, like we call that actually permission, like, and like, and like you hear the components in there of what you're doing, of like creating safety for the other person, right? Like how do we create a safe enough environment for the person to show themselves, right? And which is an interesting one, given you're taking a photo, right? Or you're doing photography. So like, why is it so important that, like, it's not just they just stand there and give you the right look? What is it about them being themselves? And I'm sort of using my term in there, but like, what is it about them answering those kind of questions or sharing that kind of stuff that actually changes the experience and ultimately changes the actual end product?
Yeah, well, the initial inquiry for portraits is never about the connection. The initial inquiry is to get the portraits. And so a lot of times people are thrown off guard when I go down the route of asking questions that are more personal about your family members. And and it's it's a lot of practice for me to reframe responses, because it's so often I have clients that will default to like struggles. And I think that's because it's like high alert and a lot of times of whatever struggles are happening. And when you ask questions, it's defaulted to that way. So being able to reframe client responses of not putting in what we practice of opinions in this, right? But to help clients see some of those things in like a positive light, opposed to where they're at in it.
Yeah.
I went on a tangent there. Was that even your question?
That was great. And there was something that you just mentioned at the beginning of your response there that now I just lost it. Whoops.
I think that like I want to jump back to one other piece, because I think like, and in the podcast and in the conversations, like that like idea of what connection is important, but also like what I was hearing is that like the other side of like what disconnection feels like. And you were talking about like you were having these sessions that just they didn't feel creative, but then they sort of felt rote. Like, and for me that sounded a lot like, that disconnection. And so was it the lack of connection that was creating that, or the creativity, or like what was it that was sort of felt like it was making that type of photography less sustainable?
It was transactional, and in an industry that has no barrier to entry, I think that's a differentiator in providing a service to people, that you can truly bring a positive experience for people outside of the exact service that I offer.
And what was the impact on you when you're not able to connect? Like what, like in some of like before, when you were feeling that, like what, like how does that affect you when you're not able to feel like you're having that, or it feels less creative and more kind of boilerplate?
Yeah, I'm an artist at first, so there's a billion other things I can do for a lot more money. So if it's not fulfilling to me, then I should be doing something else.
Yeah. And like in those moments, like what was it like? So is it then like you're exploring where you can be more creative? Like, is it like, so I guess what I'm asking almost is like, what drives yours? So you were in weddings and now you've, transitioned that business and it evolves. Like what drives that evolution of your business, do you think?
Well, it was first forced by a pandemic, and there wasn't any weddings.
We can relate to that. Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah. I would like a redo. I didn't handle that very well in retrospect. Anyways.
The pandemic, or which
how I handled having time, and how I handled losing work, and I put too much identity into who I was in the work I do, and I didn't handle that anxiety and change, or the change I handled with more anxiety and worry than I took as an opportunity. And
what did that create? Like what, like that anxiety and that worry, like then that, if you will, manifested into what?
Like, a crazy person for a little while.
We can relate to that too.
Yeah. It was that like just running around trying to figure out what to do next, or what was the crazy person part?
Yeah. Well, what am I going to do next? What does that look like? And then the overwhelm and anxiety behind it. Like I knew what anxiety was, but I had never personally experienced what anxiety actually physically manifests like. And that it's still part of, I haven't overcome the anxiety part even, like there's still some triggers that cause some anxiety. So having a lot of empathy for wherever anybody's at, like that's one thing I can show up to have empathy and understanding where anybody is at in life, in anxiety form anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was it like so tell me about like how you turned the corner then, because you said like I could have a do-over in that, but it sounds like some good things came out of it as well.
Yeah. Turns out that you can do fun things with family and friends on the weekends when you're not photographing other people's weddings.
A whole new world having a weekend.
It is. And I have a 7-year-old son, and there is a limited amount of time that he's going to be wanting to spend with me. So even though I still love photographing weddings, I know I will never regret allocating my time on the weekends more to my family. So that's the season of life that I'm in. And I'm grateful that I have a career that it turns out that I can still photograph and it doesn't have to be on the weekends. And that you can evolve with life and what is important to you. And it really did allow me to like reevaluate what was important to me and separate a little bit of who I am with what I do, and find out how that can exist, not intertwined as the same thing.
Yeah, so there was like, that's an interesting, like how you define that, separate who I am from what I do, because that sounds like this other level of connection, right? Like how deeply connected, if you will, we can be to like that identity of who we are and what we do. Was there a part of that, like through the pandemic, that was like a breakup of that? Like just, because I think about for myself, like there's multiple times with like, this is who I am. And then like that transition to being somebody else is generally not like bunnies and roses for sure. So I'm curious, like, was there like a divorcing of yourself, to use a broader term, but like a disconnect to then find this other identity?
I think it's an evolution, and just even telling Bree my introduction today, I'm like, who am I? What am I doing? Yeah, I think it's a work in progress. I don't have a defined moment specifically where that has happened. That's a work in progress.
And how does it, oh, go ahead, Bree. Yeah.
I was going to say, what gives you the confidence to continue down this path and doing the work that's in progress?
Doing the work that's in progress behind it. Well, if I totally wanted to be disconnected about who I am and what I do, I would just go get a job somewhere. And I know that being self-employed, that it is the autonomy that I want and the purpose and how I want to show up in the world and what I do. And also that can change. I can change my mind and go get a job anytime I want. But currently, this is what I like to do and what I want to spend my time doing. So having boundaries around this is important to me for sustainability. I think being a creative, and as long as I have been, I see burnout. And with the burnout, I know you have to recreate yourself. You have to have change. You have to change your goals. You have to have other things that you do to drive that creativity and that will to keep going as somebody who's self-employed and a creative. And also, I think I can contribute working retail for a few years while I was working on building my business, that I never want to go back to something like that. So, yeah.
I'm curious what, like, oh, go ahead, Bree. Yeah.
I know, too many fun things here. I wanted to dig into like the connection, and if there's a connection between connection and burnout, because you mentioned that you've seen a lot of people being burnt out, but also that like being with your son on the weekends and like getting this time with him, and then also the conversations that you're having with your clients. Does connection, and or I should say, how does that connection impact your ability to address and face burnout?
Well, connection allows how I serve my clients, like having that be something of value in my business and how I interact with people and how I put that into my service allows it to be fulfilling and important in how I show up. So it's not just transactional, there's other layers to it. And I think the challenges between having like that, building that connection, it allows you or me to not necessarily be in the flow of it. So understanding like flow and how we need that in our lives, but also understanding like if you master something, that you have to also master that next thing or have that next thing that you go towards. Like the challenge for me currently is just that I have different clients that come in that I get to have the opportunity to challenge myself to find that new connection. And that's allowing me to challenge that flow a little bit, but also build onto it.
Yeah, there seems to be this like, and I think you mentioned it, even like the relationship between not getting burnt out and change. Like that, it sounds to me like for you, like change needs to be like, what part does change play in decreasing the potential for burnout for you?
Say that again.
What part does change play? Like having like things changing. Like how much is that, like how does that, because I think you mentioned like I need the change so I don't get burnt out. Like tell me more about like how change plays into decreasing burnout for you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different kinds of a change too. Having that's forced upon you and change that you're choosing to do.
Right.
That's a couple different things. Like the pandemic was forced upon change. I think it's a practice to see that forced upon change as opportunities.
Yeah.
And then I think the burnout of having the same thing, like if you do the same thing all the time, that burnout happens because you don't have the care about it. Like you just go through the movements. So finding things to change and finding ways to make obstacles or trying new things, like that allows the change to happen.
Because what does it give you? Like, what do you get more of than that in when that's happening that you don't when change is forced on you?
Besides anxiety,
yeah, and it's almost like anxiety is there in either one, right? Like to a certain degree, like there's a change I make and the change that happened. They both have anxiety, but for some reason, one's different. Like what are you getting out of one that maybe not so much in the other?
Yeah. What came to mind, and I don't even know if this is on course of answering the question, but what came to mind is when you are allowed to make change, if you're going to make change, like for example, when I purchased my studio building, that was a big deal. That's a big investment. That's a big commitment. That change was alleviated by, and I wish I could contribute who this was, I learned this from, but fear setting, making all the, what if this happens, like making a list of all the bad things that could happen. So for my studio, like I can't pay the mortgage. What if there's a fire? What if there's a break-in? What if, like so many different things. like all those fears of the unknown. Whereas when you have forced change, you don't even get an opportunity to evaluate what those what ifs are, and you're just in it. So it's like being thrown into a pool or walking into the pool.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just, there's like an isolating feeling with that, right? Like when it's like when you don't get that, that ability to at least like make the choice in there, right?
Right.
Like, and so when choice is removed, then like what, yeah, that's just a different feeling. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And you asked what was it, what did I gain from it? Is that what the question?
Yeah. Or what did you get more of? What do you have more of when you're in that type of change? Yeah.
I think we're always growing. So if you don't have the change, you're not growing as an individual in whatever that may be, like within relationships, within your business, within whatever you're doing. So change, whether it's anticipated or forced upon you, you're growing and evolving. And I think something with that is like having some reflection and understanding like what you're learning from that is really an important part of the process too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you always know that growth was a value of yours?
I think being self-employed, that I have implemented in like education and putting myself in uncomfortable situations is part of being successful in my business. And I don't know everything. I can't know anything. Somebody's got to be doing it better than I am. And I don't even know what that thing is, but I'm going to find out how I can improve and do things like a small percentage differently or better or whatever that is. So yes, growth has always been important.
And
go ahead, Bree. Yep.
I was going to say, how do you have an intentional growth process? Like, how do you identify the things that you want to improve on and then take that next step?
Yeah. How much time do we have left? So I have like a weekly checklist that I do with my assistant, and I do it with her because it keeps me in check to do it, because otherwise I'd be like, I've got way more important things to do than this. And within that checklist, I have like, what are the educational things that we're doing? What are the networking things we're doing? And then what are the pain points and wins? And this is the one I really like to do, because it's also around gratitude for what we're doing, as well as taking the pain points that could cause so much frustration, have a bucket to put it in, like whether it was a client that called and asked a question about something that I thought I had went over, and like, why are they asking this? Okay, but what's the lesson in it? What did I do that I can change in that, so that that isn't a pain point, that isn't a point of resistance? Like, what is the thing that I can do in my business to change that? Allowing me to look at, okay, this thing has happened one time, it's a one-off thing. Maybe I don't need to change anything. Or this thing has happened 3 times. That looks like it's a process thing for me, and I should look at how that can be changed. So yes, I have an entire spreadsheet built out of how I do that.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like coming almost like bringing this back kind of full circle, like, because we talked about change and burnout, and then how like change that was within your control, when you can add that like kind of like you get like, that's the sort of transition into growth, right? Like that. And what I'm hearing, but I would love your insight on it, is like how growth is then now correlated to connection with yourself, but with your clients, and like how does that process maybe even lead to more connection? Like, how are those two related?
Yeah. So I have a lot of spreadsheets, but again, like the client of when I have somebody that books with me, obviously I'm keeping track of what they ordered, but also keeping track of what was the biggest connection for them, like what was the importance of that, and having to measure that makes me accountable for making sure that happens.
Does it also help you feel as though you're using your term like evolving?
Yeah, with anything, like when I think I know the age of kids and where they're at, and then come out with a different connection than what I maybe have previously assumed that would be important to them. Like, absolutely, that's always, you pretty much have to come into any interaction as an open mind of what connection to that person or that family is. Yeah.
And if you don't feel like you're growing, do you think it's like harder to create connection, whether it's with the client or even outside of there? Like, is there a correlation there? Like, I don't necessarily feel like we're growing, so it's almost harder to create it sometimes, or have it with yourself even. Like, I'm just curious about like how connection and growth are intertwined here.
Yeah. So I think that starts with intention before having conversations about connection. So leaving whatever personal things that I might have show up, but think about the conversation I'm about to get into. Like, what is my intention around this? And then going into that conversation with that intention.
So it's more like you're saying, like, it's like I plan the growth in there. Is that
right? Or being open to it, because if you're not open to it, then you're reactive to it, or you don't even see it at all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Bree, you look like you're chomping at the bit for something. I've interrupted you.
I'm really
twice,
enjoying this right now. I'm actually just watching right now.
This has been so great to talk about. Thank you guys for the opportunity to dig into this.
Yeah. And how much like in your industry, like how much attention is paid to that idea of connection? And yeah, we'll start there. Like, what do you like broader in your experience in your industry, like how much attention is paid to connection, not just with the client, but like with each other, right? Like as professionals.
So within the wedding industry, okay, so I had a business coach when I went full-time in my business, and he was like, you have to go out there and network. You need to keep track of like all the networking you're doing, and your minimum expectation is four different events a week. And I was like, oh, that's a lot. And I have to talk to people, right? My wedding business is successful and still successful because of the true connections that I've made with other people in the industry. And I think that's so true to anybody in business. If you show up with true curiosity for other people, that you can build connection with them. And that's even like in a grocery store line, or like, like not necessarily just putting your blinders on to what the world is. But it does take some intention to show up in a networking meeting and go in and want to have those connections. And there was a gal that I met with early on in my networking, was somebody who she was like, how can I help you? Like that in itself was like changing for my business and how I connect with other people. Like even going into a wedding day, to reach out with vendors ahead of time to be like, how can I help you make this a great experience for your client, for what you need out of the event? Like, especially with a videographer who is right next to me and is trying to do a great service for the clients, and we're both doing the same thing. Like, how can I show up for them. And it's
Mm.
reciprocated to be like, how can I show up for you? And in
Yeah.
that, we all win. The client wins. Working with other people, we know what they need. They know what I need. Like, it just works really well to have that connection.
Yeah. It sounds almost scary to build sometimes. Like, especially you identify that, like, that videographer, like you just said, like, we're kind of doing the same thing, like that, like, how are they going to respond to me? How are they going to, like, but like, how do you push into that, or how do you do it anyway? Right. Like, hey, we're going to help each other, and I don't know how you're going to respond to this. How do you lean into that?
I think coming ahead with that, like wanting the best outcome for everybody everybody has a collection of their own experiences, right? So I've had times where I've worked with people who are guarded about that and not wanting to share, like wanting to have walls up almost from past interactions that weren't good, and that they just wanted to lay the land with me of like how this is going to work. And I meet that with an understanding that the reason they're coming to me is because of the bad experiences that they might have had working with a photographer.
Yeah. Well, I love how we, like, the conversation kind of got like almost circular, right? Like started with connection and then coming back in. And one of the things I've noticed is, obviously we spend a lot of time asking questions with transformational listening and everything. But one of the things I always experience when, like, I get asked, questions about what I often take for granted, like the things I do daily, is like, I tend to start to think about like new ideas and I'm just curious, like, in the last 45 minutes we've been talking about connection and about your process and growth, has there been any like ideas for you about like, oh, here's what I want to do more of, or different, or like maybe even a change in like how like how you're approaching connection to some degree? Like, what have you processed in the 45 minutes?
Yeah. I didn't write down anything, and usually I write down, but I also didn't take a lot of opportunity to listen. I was just making or answering the questions.
Yeah.
I don't know that I communicate the importance of connections and what that is like in my business to my clients. So and it started with just the intro, like how do you want to be introduced? Like, it seems as though I'm introduced as a photographer, and I know that I want to have a more meaning behind the connection part of what that service is. So finding a way to make my message to the world and what I do and how I serve people, have it be around that.
Well, yeah. And it's kind of funny for me drawing this correlation, because very early on in my career, I was told I had to get a headshot. So I just went to JCPenney and did like one of those $50 headshots. You aren't doing that. Not only that, I hated that headshot. I was pasty, my hair was weird, and I had this weird smile. It was bad headshot.
Yeah.
And you aren't churning through people. You aren't like just snapping a photo of them and saying like, okay, swipe your credit card, here's your picture, we're done. You're offering them an experience and getting to know them on a deeper level so that you can represent them through your art. It's not just snap a picture and deliver it to them. It's so much deeper than that. So that's what I love, kind of hearing that difference. People might not understand what that difference is when it comes to photography and when they're going through this process. And not only that, but why there's premiums for excellent photographers. It's because you're going through this process to make sure that you are capturing their essence.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I think it's interesting as you kind of outlined it, like how, and I see this like in so many different industries, it's like how easy it is for us to kind of like take for connection for granted, but also like take it out of the equation as though it doesn't matter. It's you talked about like with Bree and like the JCPenney, like we're probably going to get sued on this right now. Anyway, but like but that like that boiler the boilerplate sort of like, here's our business. And I think that you can do that in almost any business, right? Like, I'm here to do X service. Yeah. And in that, there's this like inherent, like almost like assumed, like, but we don't need to relate, I'm not here to be your friend, I think is what you hear sometimes. But like, as you were saying, like, it's so, for your business is such a profound part, if you will, of the business, so integral to your success, but also your ability to, evolve and not get burnt out. Like, I think there's a very strong connection between boilerplate, I'm just doing the thing to do, and burnout. And I think that like that difference, as you've articulated, I think very well in the last 45 minutes, the difference is connection. Right? Mm-hmm. Do I feel connected to them? Do I feel connected to myself and my own growth? And that other part of like, am I connecting with the other professionals, in the industry? Like, and it's just really neat to see, like, to start to see that contrast of like how that, like, and then when it goes away, like in the pandemic, we don't have connection, and what kind of impact that can create. Yeah, I appreciate that. Was such a great kind of story and unpacking. I appreciate you handling the questions. Like, I tend to get like, tell me about this. Yeah. So.
Well, and what's so funny is at the beginning of this, I asked Brian, I was like, so are we going to go through like our question of the week process? And we ended up just like straight asking questions for the whole 45 minutes. We did that. Instead of 10 minutes, it was 45 minutes.
Yeah. Now you just got the more. So I thought just in the last, I was like, yeah, I've just peppered Jeannine with questions and Bree as well. And thought maybe at the end, if there's questions that you have, of us, I don't know how that fits in, but I felt it more appropriate to be like, yeah, I just peppered you. I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. Yeah.
Well, I'm often the one asking the questions, so it was different being on the other end of it, how to respond to different things, and really it that point of reflection and audibly saying things is it's a different for me. So I appreciate this opportunity. What was it that connection? What is it about connection that you have this mission in the world to talk about?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. Yeah, trying to answer that in less than a half hour, really. but it's for me, it's later in life, I think I discovered how missing it was, right? Like how we can sort of, if you will, take that for granted. And there was, and I think it's somewhat in how we describe it a little bit in as much as like, we know when it's there and we know when it's not there, right? And I think like a lot of people, having really profound experiences when it's not there, that are then, like juxtaposed to the moments that like connection saves your life, right? Like that interaction that can be a conversation with a stranger to a conversation. And when the pandemic started, similar to your story, and we had been doing this practice, my friends and I don't know that we really understood how critical it was. And then when I started seeing people, come on the practice calls when we just had one question, it just started to like open up, like, oh, there's something here that like that is sort of missing. And then and once I started to see it, I just started to see it everywhere, right? And so it's like my wife is a therapist, and we say this all the time, like usually the best therapist is the one working on themselves, right? So I think it certainly came from, my own place of like, hey, this is this uncomfortable thing that is super needed that I've absolutely taken for granted. And then getting in the conversation is the same, like, oh, I really kind of sucked at that for a long time and still challenged with it today. But like, so being able to solve the problem that is your own problem is the root of any business, or any good business, right? Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it was a great, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate what you do in social media. I think how you show up with these little stories on for the world to take in little bits of like what those connections are. It's a really great way of how connection in a lot of different industries with a lot of different people is really personal.
No, I appreciate that. Well, this was fantastic. I would say our first new format that isn't the live version was a success today. So Jeannine, I appreciate your time and your bravery and your vulnerability, and Bree for helping out and having better questions than me at certain points, but also for keeping the whole ship running here. Everybody that didn't watch, you didn't see before we hit record, it was like, what are we going to do here? And Bree's coming like, well, maybe we should have some structure. So yeah, so all the structure you see was from Bree. So thank you, Bree, as always, and thank you, Jeannine. Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Bye. Have a good one.
All right. See ya.